But tonight begins the countdown to what could be the most important announcement of Barack Obama's presidency. In less than 24 hours, the president will address the nation to lay out his new strategy for the now 8-year-old war in Afghanistan, a strategy that is being advance-billed as what frankly sounds like a paradox, an escalation of the war that is also supposed to spell out an end to the war. Mr. Obama will speak at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern, but some of the details of his decision are becoming known tonight. Most dramatically, the president has reportedly decided to ramp up the number of American troops in Afghanistan. He's expected to announce the eventual deployment of about 30,000 more Americans, the first of which could be in place by Christmas. Those troops will reportedly be sent to Taliban strongholds in southern Afghanistan, as well as the border with Pakistan in the eastern part of the country. Officials say the mission of the newly bolstered American forces will be a mix of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, essentially protecting the Afghan people while at the same time escalating the fight against Taliban and al-Qaeda-linked insurgent fighters. U.S. troops will also accelerate the training of Afghanistan's own security forces. Mr. Obama spent the day today briefing world leaders on his decision. He's expected to brief dozens of members of Congress tomorrow afternoon before the big speech. If the president does promise an escalation of 30,000 troops, one factor we have discussed on this show that's not yet received broad attention is the impact that would have on America's overall military readiness. As reported earlier this month by the Washington Independent Spencer Ackerman, the U.S. Army currently has about 50,000 active duty soldiers capable of deploying right now. Many of those troops have already served 2 or 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, some even more than that. An additional commitment of 30,000 American soldiers would thus leave only about 20,000 deployable soldiers here at home in the event of some unforeseen emergency. Contributions from other branches of the military could, of course, change this mix, but in any mix, this decision may stretch thin a military already bearing the strain of 8 years of war in 2 theaters. That said, unnamed military officials now tell reporters that the escalation in Afghanistan will be gradual over the course of the next year and a half, an additional brigade deploying every 4 months or so, completing the increase not next year, but in the first half of the year after that, which means 2011. Which means this war that began in 2001 will see the culmination of a major escalation 10 years later in 2011. And then after we've escalated, of course, we'll stay a while longer yet. As a reminder, it was 7.5 years ago when President Bush essentially declared victory in Afghanistan.
A vicious regime has been toppled in Afghanistan, and an entire people have been liberated from oppression. Because of American soldiers and our brave allies and friends who have fought beside them, the Taliban is out of business.
Big smile. 7.5 years after the previous president crowed with that big smile about the Taliban being out of business, U.S. forces are heading back, in even larger numbers, to face the same supposedly vanquished enemy. And on the eve of President Obama's big announcement about Afghanistan, there may be an explanation of why. A bombshell report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee details one of the major missteps in executing the war back in 2001. In December 2001, U.S. troops had Osama bin Laden in their crosshairs in the mountains of Tora Bora in Afghanistan. U.S. forces in the area requested backup for a large-scale attack on bin Laden's presumed location. They wanted troops as well to be blocking his exit path through the mountains into Pakistan. Those requests were turned down. Officials in Washington decided to send fewer than 100 U.S. commandos, and Osama bin Laden did ultimately walk away into Pakistan. The new Senate Armed Services Committee report concludes that, quote, the failure to finish the job represents a lost opportunity that forever altered the course of the conflict in Afghanistan and the future of international terrorism, leaving the American people more vulnerable to terrorism, laying the foundation for today's protracted Afghan insurgency and inflaming the internal strife now endangering Pakistan. The decision not to deploy American forces to go after bin Laden or block his escape was made by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and his top commander, General Tommy Franks. And then 8 Decembers later, with a new defense secretary, and after many new top commanders, A new president has apparently decided that the old war should be born again. Joining us now is Dan Rather, managing editor and host of Dan Rather Reports on HDNet. He has traveled to Afghanistan 11 times over the past, 3 decades or so. He has just returned from his most recent trip there. His reporting will air on HDNet starting next week. Mr. Rather, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Is the mission now a logical extension of that failed effort to get bin Laden back in 2001? Or when you're on the ground there now, does it seem like a born again war with its own post-2001 point now?
Well, it seems like a born again war. When you were there, and we concentrated on going as far forward as we could go, concentrating this trip in Kunar province, which is against the Pakistan border. You mentioned earlier that the additional deployment of troops will be sent to Helmand province, which is in the deep southwest, the so-called Taliban headquarters, and Kunar province, which is up against Pakistan, one of the most dangerous places in the country. When you're there, when you're in the field, and we spent a number of days in forward positions, it is a repurposed war, and I think the big difference between this trip and when I was last there last December was the change in strategy. There's been a direct, a calculated change in strategy to what the military calls realignment. And this is giving up wide areas of the country, rural areas of the country, in favor of protecting population areas, particularly those population areas that have roads that can supply them, don't have to be supplied by air. So you want to keep in mind that this realignment is part of what requires, in the military's view, the additional troops. Now, whether it turns out to be 20,000 additional troops, 35,000, whatever, no one should kid themselves. This is not going to make a major difference in Afghanistan, except perhaps in the very short term to buy a little bit of time. Afghanistan is vast. The terrain is hostile. And you can't think of it just as Afghanistan. You do have to underline, italicize, put in all caps, the Pakistan part of this. So it's more an Afghanistan-Pakistan war, and we can't kid ourselves. We have to understand that very clearly, and we made a specific change in strategy, this so-called realignment strategy, in the late spring or early summer, and it's still being effected. And the reason General McChrystal asked for additional troops was, having decided on a new strategy, says, I need more troops to carry out this strategy. But Rachel, there's nothing more important than understanding that in Afghanistan, that however you describe our mission, however you describe the ultimate goal, the principal obstacles to it are, in no particular order, corruption, cronyism, mismanagement in terms of the government. We're talking about the government in Kabul specifically, but also down in the tribal warlord area, plus the tremendous production of opium, some of the finances of which go to support the Taliban and anti-U.S. forces, and the resistance of the majority of mullahs in the country to what they say in the privacy of the mosque, the foreigners, the infidels being there. Those are tremendous obstacles. I don't say they can't be overcome, but I do say we have to understand that it's going to take a lot and take a long time, and the question for the American people and the question for the president is, do we want to do this? Do we really want to do it? And can we do it? There is an undercurrent in the U.S. military which says, listen, we're going to do what the president orders. We're doing our best, and one can't say enough about their valor, about their effectiveness, about their dedication. There's an undercurrent saying, has anybody considered that we may be spending ourselves into oblivion by staying here as long as we've stayed here? This is not to be negative for the sake of being negative. It's just to lay it out. When you're on the ground, particularly in forward positions, these are the things you hear people talking about as kind of an undercurrent, and this is the reality of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is tribal to the extent that you can't imagine. It is predominantly rural. I'm afraid we become kind of Kabul-centric in our thinking, but it's predominantly rural, and it is basically illiterate. The official literacy rate is about 10%. I think it's probably somewhat below that. Isn't to say the Afghans are dumb, they aren't. They're quick on the uptake, they're smart, and they're hardworking. But when you talk about rebuilding the Afghan army, the Afghan police, and the Afghan border patrol, you have to understand what a huge undertaking it is, given the fact, and it is a fact, that the literacy rate is only about 10%.
Well, let me ask you about, I mean, the troop surge, we know that the numbers of troops is not everything in strategy. Obviously, the troop numbers are something that fit into a broader strategy. But from your reporting and your time there, you're saying that qualitatively the number of troops isn't going to make that much of a difference. Qualitatively, what might make a difference is the change in strategy. But when you talk about this realignment and focusing on population centers, I think, didn't the Russians do that? Didn't the Russians do that and fail? Wasn't that part of what they tried?
The Russians did do a version of that. We also did a version of it in Vietnam. It was called the enclave theory at that time.
Yeah.
However, the military people, and not just the people with stars on their shoulders, will say there's a big difference in what we're trying and what the Russians tried. That we are coupling this with the use of so-called soft power. People from the State Department, people who work with AID, various civilian workers. And